On the morning of April 14, 1987, in the small farming town of Verden, Oklahoma, a 23-year-old mother named Kirsten Hatfield made a phone call that would haunt investigators for decades. Her voice, witnesses would later recall, carried an unusual flatness when she reported that her 4-year-old daughter, Amy Jo Hatfield, was missing from her bedroom. The child had vanished sometime in the night from a house locked from the inside, her window closed, her covers pulled back as if she had simply risen and walked away. But 4-year-olds don't vanish into April darkness on their own. Someone had taken her. The question that would consume a community and destroy a family was simple, terrible, and would take 38 years to answer. Who would steal a sleeping child from her bed, and why would those closest to her wait so long to tell the truth? The town of Verden sits in Grady County in central Oklahoma, a place where Highway 62 cuts through flat prairie land that stretches toward the horizon in every direction. In 1987, Verden had fewer than 600 residents. Everyone knew everyone. The local economy depended on wheat farming, cattle ranching, and the kind of small businesses that serviced rural life. A feed store, a filling station, a diner where farmers gathered at dawn for coffee and gossip. Houses sat on large lots separated by fields and gravel roads. At night, the darkness was absolute, broken only by occasional porch lights and the distant glow of Chickasha, the county seat, 8 miles to the north. The Hatfield family lived on the outskirts of town in a modest single-story house with white siding and a covered front porch. Kirsten Hatfield, 23 years old, had grown up in the area. She had married young to Danny Hatfield, a 26-year-old construction worker with a solid build and a quiet demeanor. Those who knew them described the couple as unremarkable, young parents trying to make ends meet, raising 2 children in a place where life moved slowly and options were limited. Their daughter, Amy Jo, had just turned 4 in February. She had light brown hair that fell past her shoulders, wide eyes, and a gap-toothed smile that appeared in the few photographs the family would later provide to investigators. Her younger brother, Michael, was not yet 2. April 14, 1987, began as a Tuesday like any other. The morning air carried the smell of turned earth from fields being prepared for planting. Kirsten woke early, as mothers of small children do, to the sound of birds and the rumble of a distant tractor. Danny had already left for a construction site in Norman, a 40-minute drive northeast. Kirsten made breakfast, simple fare, cereal for Amy Jo, a bottle for Michael. The house was quiet in the way houses in small towns are quiet, with only the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of floorboards underfoot. Amy Jo had spent the previous day playing in the yard. A neighbor, Mrs. Alina Briggs, would later tell deputies that she'd seen the little girl around 4 in the afternoon, pushing a toy shopping cart back and forth on the gravel driveway. "She waved at me," Mrs. Briggs said, "just a little hand up in the air. I waved back. That was the last time I saw her." That evening, Kirsten bathed both children and put them to bed early. Amy Jo slept in a small bedroom at the back of the house, her bed positioned beneath a window that looked out onto an empty field. Michael slept in a crib in his parents' room. According to Kirsten's later statement to police, she checked on Amy Jo around 10:30 that night. The child was asleep, her small body curled beneath a thin quilt patterned with yellow ducks. Kirsten said she closed the door and went to bed herself. Danny was not home. He had told her he was staying overnight in Norman with a coworker to avoid the drive. It was something he did occasionally when a job ran late. The house settled into darkness. No one heard anything unusual. No dogs barked. No cars passed on the gravel road. The night was still and unremarkable in every way that mattered. At approximately 7:15 the next morning, Kirsten entered Amy Jo's bedroom to wake her for breakfast. The bed was empty. The quilt had been pulled back and lay in a heap at the foot of the mattress. The pillow still bore the impression of a small head. The window was closed and locked from the inside. The bedroom door, which Kirsten insisted she had closed the night before, stood open. Kirsten's reaction, as she would describe it to the dispatcher at the Grady County Sheriff's Office 11 minutes later, was immediate confusion followed by rising panic. She searched the house, calling Amy Jo's name. She checked closets, the bathroom, under beds. She went outside and walked the perimeter of the property, still calling. The morning was cool, the sky overcast. The field stretched empty in every direction. There was no sign of the child. At 7:26 a.m., Kirsten called 911. The recording of that call, later reviewed by investigators, captured a woman whose voice seemed oddly controlled. "My daughter is missing," she said. "She's not in her bed. I don't know where she is." The dispatcher asked standard questions. How old? What was she wearing? When did you last see her? Kirsten answered each question with brief, factual responses. She did not cry. Those who would later listen to the tape noted the absence of hysteria, the measured cadence of her speech. It was a detail that meant nothing at the time but would grow in significance as the hours passed. Deputies arrived at the Hatfield home at 7:43 a.m. The first officer on scene was Deputy Mark Crowley, a 12-year veteran who had worked missing child cases before. He found Kirsten standing on the front porch, her arms crossed over her chest. She led him inside and showed him Amy Jo's empty bedroom. Crowley noted the locked window, the undisturbed state of the room. He asked Kirsten to walk him through the previous evening in detail. She repeated what she had told the dispatcher. Amy Jo had gone to bed around 8:30. Kirsten had checked on her at 10:30. The child was asleep. Kirsten had not heard anything during the night. "Where is your husband?" Crowley asked. "Norman," Kirsten said. "He stayed there for work." "Have you called him?" "Not yet." Crowley found this odd but did not press. Within the hour, additional deputies arrived, along with volunteers from the community. The search began in earnest. By mid-morning, more than 40 people had gathered at the Hatfield property. Volunteers spread out across the surrounding fields, walking in organized lines, calling Amy Jo's name. The Grady County Sheriff's Office coordinated the effort, dividing the search area into grids. Bloodhounds were brought in from Oklahoma City. The dogs picked up a scent near Amy Jo's bedroom window but lost it within 50 yards, near the gravel road. This suggested the child had been carried away in a vehicle. Investigators began interviewing neighbors. Mrs. Briggs repeated what she had told deputies earlier. She had seen Amy Jo playing outside the previous afternoon, but had noticed nothing unusual. Other neighbors reported the same. No one had seen strangers in the area. No unfamiliar vehicles had been spotted on the road. The Hatfield house sat at the end of a dead-end lane, visible from only 2 other properties, both occupied by elderly couples who went to bed early. By noon, the search had expanded to include the banks of Sugar Creek, a muddy waterway that ran through farmland a half-mile south of the house. Divers checked culverts and drainage ditches. Helicopters from the Oklahoma Highway Patrol flew overhead, scanning fields and wooded areas. Local media arrived, setting up cameras near the command post that had been established in the Hatfield driveway. Kirsten stood in front of the cameras and made a brief statement, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. She held a photograph of Amy Jo, taken at Christmas. In the photo, the little girl wore a red dress and smiled at the camera. Kirsten's voice wavered but did not break. She thanked the volunteers and walked back inside. Danny Hatfield arrived home around 2 in the afternoon. He had been contacted by deputies in Norman and had driven back immediately. Witnesses described him as distraught, his face pale, his movements agitated. He spoke to investigators for more than an hour, providing details about his whereabouts the previous night. He had been staying with a coworker named Tim Ashford at an apartment complex near the construction site. Ashford confirmed this, though he noted that Danny had left the apartment around 9 p.m. to get some air and had not returned until after midnight. Danny explained that he had driven around, stopped at a convenience store, and sat in his truck thinking about work stress and money problems. He had receipts from a gas station in Norman, time-stamped at 9:37 p.m. Deputies noted this timeline carefully. The drive from Norman to Verden took approximately 40 minutes. If Danny had left at 9 p.m., he could have been home by 9:40. If he had taken Amy Jo sometime between 10 and 11 p.m., he could have returned to Norman by midnight. But this was speculation. There was no evidence, no witnesses, no body. The search continued for 3 days. Volunteers walked every field within a 5-mile radius. Ponds were dragged. Abandoned buildings were checked. The FBI was contacted and sent agents to assist with the investigation. A command center was established at the Verden Community Center, where maps were pinned to walls and tips were logged on index cards. The community rallied. Local churches organized prayer vigils. A reward fund was started, eventually reaching $5,000. But Amy Jo Hatfield remained missing. As the days passed, hope began to fade. Investigators shifted their focus from a search and rescue operation to a criminal investigation. They began looking more closely at the family. Those who knew Danny Hatfield described him as a hard worker but noted that he had a temper. He had been arrested once, 3 years earlier, for disorderly conduct after a bar fight in Chickasha. The charges had been dropped. Coworkers said he was reliable but kept to himself. He did not socialize much. He seemed to carry a weight, they said, though no one could say what it was. Kirsten was more difficult to read. Neighbors described her as polite but distant. She did not attend church or participate in community events. She kept the house clean and cared for her children, but there was something in her manner, some witnesses said, that seemed detached. One neighbor, speaking years later, would say, "She was a good mother in all the ways you could see, but there was something missing. A warmth, maybe. I don't know how to explain it." Investigators interviewed both Danny and Kirsten multiple times. They asked about the marriage, about finances, about stress. Both insisted that everything was fine. They had arguments like any couple, but nothing serious. They loved their children. They had no idea what had happened to Amy Jo. Deputies noted inconsistencies in their statements. Kirsten said she had closed Amy Jo's bedroom door before going to bed, but the door had been open when she found the room empty. Danny said he had left Norman at 9 p.m. but could not account for where he had been for nearly 3 hours. His receipts showed only a single gas purchase. The distance on his truck's odometer, when checked later, showed he had driven more than 80 miles that night, more than the round trip from Norman to the apartment. But inconsistencies are not evidence. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves. They suspected Danny. Some suspected Kirsten. A few believed an outsider had taken the child. Without a body, without a witness, without physical evidence, the case stalled. By early May, the search teams disbanded. The command center was closed. The media moved on. The FBI returned to Oklahoma City. The case file remained open, but active investigation ceased. Amy Jo Hatfield became a statistic, another missing child whose face would fade from flyers and memory. In the months that followed, the Hatfield family tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, though those who observed them could see the cracks forming. Kirsten and Danny stayed in the house on the outskirts of Verden for another 6 months. Neighbors reported seeing them less and less. The front porch, once neatly swept, accumulated leaves. The yard grew wild. The toy shopping cart that Amy Jo had pushed across the gravel driveway sat abandoned near the side of the house, its plastic wheels sinking into the dirt. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt suspicion take root in the quietest hours of the night, the experience of living with unspoken accusations is corrosive. Friends and family members later said that Kirsten and Danny barely spoke to each other after the first few months. Meals were eaten in silence. Michael, the toddler, seemed to sense the tension and became clingy, crying whenever his mother left the room. By November 1987, the couple made the decision to leave Verden. They moved to Tulsa, more than 100 miles northeast, where Danny found work with a construction company, and Kirsten took a part-time job at a grocery store. They rented a small apartment in a complex filled with transient workers and young families. It was a place where no one asked questions, where anonymity was easy. In Tulsa, the Hatfields tried to rebuild. They did not speak about Amy Jo. Photographs of her were packed away in boxes. When acquaintances asked if they had other children, Kirsten would say, "Just one," referring to Michael. Danny told coworkers he had no children. It was as if Amy Jo had been erased, her existence scrubbed from their present in an attempt to escape the weight of the past. But trauma, especially trauma laced with guilt or knowledge, does not vanish simply because it is ignored. Michael, as he grew older, began exhibiting behaviors that concerned his teachers. He was withdrawn in preschool, preferring to play alone. He drew pictures that disturbed the adults around him, dark scribbles of figures lying on the ground, red crayon smeared across the page. When a teacher asked what the pictures were, Michael said, "That's Sissy." The teacher reported this to the school counselor, who contacted Kirsten. Kirsten said Michael was confused, that he had no sister, that the teacher was mistaken. The matter was dropped. The marriage continued to deteriorate. Danny drank more. Kirsten became increasingly isolated, spending hours alone in the apartment, staring at nothing. Friends from their early years in Verden who attempted to stay in touch found their calls unreturned. The couple existed in a kind of purgatory, neither moving forward nor fully confronting what lay behind them. In 1992, 5 years after Amy Jo disappeared, Kirsten filed for divorce. The proceedings were swift and uncontested. Danny did not fight for custody of Michael. He moved out of the apartment and took a job on an oil rig in western Oklahoma, a place where he could work long shifts and sleep in company barracks, alone. Kirsten and Michael moved into a smaller apartment in a different part of Tulsa. She worked nights at a diner, barely scraping by. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, the breaking point often comes not with a dramatic revelation but with the slow accumulation of silence. Kirsten and Michael lived together, mother and son, but there was a distance between them that neither could bridge. Michael asked about his father sometimes. Kirsten gave vague answers. He never asked about Amy Jo, perhaps sensing that the subject was forbidden. Years passed. Michael grew into a quiet, troubled adolescent. He struggled in school, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he seemed unable to connect with his peers. He spent hours alone in his room, drawing or staring out the window. Kirsten watched him and saw shadows of something she could not name, or perhaps she could name it but chose not to. In 1998, when Michael was 13, he told a school counselor that he remembered something from when he was very young. He said he remembered his father carrying something heavy out of the house at night. He said he remembered his mother crying. He said he remembered digging. The counselor, alarmed, contacted the Oklahoma Department of Human Services. A social worker interviewed Michael. He repeated the story but could not provide details. He did not know when it had happened. He did not know what his father had been carrying. He did not know where they had been digging. The social worker filed a report, but without specifics, without corroboration, the information went nowhere. The Grady County Sheriff's Office was notified, and a deputy reviewed the original case file on Amy Jo Hatfield. The file was noted and returned to storage. But something had shifted. Michael's words, vague as they were, had cracked open a door that Kirsten had kept locked for more than a decade. She began having nightmares. She would wake in the early hours of the morning, her heart pounding, her sheets damp with sweat. She started drinking, just a little at first, then more. She called in sick to work. She stopped answering the phone. In 2003, Michael left home at 18 and joined the Army. He needed distance, structure, a life separate from the ghosts that haunted the apartment in Tulsa. Kirsten was alone. She moved again, this time to a trailer park on the outskirts of Oklahoma City. She worked sporadically, drifted through relationships that never lasted, and spent long stretches of time isolated and silent. The case of Amy Jo Hatfield by this time was buried in archives. The original investigators had retired. The file had been digitized and stored in a database but was no longer actively reviewed. In small towns across Oklahoma, cold cases like this one numbered in the dozens, each representing a life interrupted, a family shattered, a truth hidden. But the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of surfacing. In October 2019, 32 years after Amy Jo Hatfield disappeared, Michael Hatfield walked into the Grady County Sheriff's Office and asked to speak to someone about an old case. He was 34 years old, a military veteran with a steady job as a mechanic in Lawton, Oklahoma. He had been in therapy for PTSD and depression, and his therapist had encouraged him to address unresolved trauma from his childhood. Michael sat across from Detective Sarah Vance, a seasoned investigator who specialized in cold cases. He told her that he needed to talk about his sister. Detective Vance pulled up the case file on Amy Jo Hatfield and listened as Michael began to speak. "I was young," he said. "Not even 2, but I remember pieces. I remember my dad carrying something wrapped in a blanket. I remember my mom standing in the doorway, not moving, just watching. I remember being in a truck. I remember the smell of dirt." Detective Vance asked if he remembered where they had gone. Michael shook his head. "Somewhere with trees," he said. "There was a clearing. I remember digging sounds. My mom was crying, but she wasn't stopping him. She just stood there." Vance asked if Michael had ever asked his parents about that night. He said he had tried once, years ago, when he was a teenager. His mother had told him he was confused, that he was remembering a nightmare. His father had refused to talk to him at all. Michael said he had buried the memories, convinced himself they were false, but they had never fully gone away. Therapy had brought them back to the surface, sharper and more insistent. Detective Vance made notes. She asked Michael if he would be willing to speak with investigators again, to undergo cognitive interviews designed to help recover fragmented memories. He agreed. Over the following months, Michael worked with forensic psychologists. Slowly, painfully, additional details emerged. He remembered a location, a wooded area south of Verden near Sugar Creek. He remembered the sound of an owl. He remembered his father's voice, low and urgent, telling his mother to get back in the truck. In February 2020, the Grady County Sheriff's Office reopened the Amy Jo Hatfield case. Investigators began by re-interviewing witnesses who were still alive. Mrs. Alina Briggs, now 92 and living in a nursing home, repeated what she had said in 1987. She had seen Amy Jo playing outside the day before she disappeared. Other neighbors had passed away or moved. The original lead investigator had died in 2015. Detectives tracked down Danny Hatfield. He was living in Amarillo, Texas, working as a night manager at a truck stop. When approached by Texas Rangers assisting Oklahoma investigators, Danny initially refused to speak. He hired an attorney. After several weeks, however, he agreed to an interview. He sat across from Detective Vance and a Texas Ranger in a small interrogation room in Amarillo. "I didn't do anything to my daughter," Danny said. His voice was flat, defensive. "I wasn't even home that night." Detective Vance presented him with the timeline discrepancies from 1987, the odometer readings, the unaccounted hours, the receipt from a single gas station. She presented him with Michael's statement. Danny's face went pale. He stared at the table. "That's not true," he said. "Michael was a baby. He doesn't remember anything." "Then help us understand," Vance said. "Where were you that night?" Danny did not answer. The interview ended. He returned to his attorney. But the case was moving forward. In March 2020, investigators obtained a warrant to search a property near Sugar Creek, south of Verden, where Michael believed he had been taken as a child. The property had changed hands multiple times over the decades and was now owned by a rancher who had no connection to the case. Cadaver dogs were brought in. On March 18, 2020, the dogs indicated a hit in a clearing near a line of cottonwood trees. Excavation began. Investigators worked slowly, carefully, using ground-penetrating radar and forensic archaeologists. On March 21st, they found remains. Small bones, partially decomposed, buried approximately 3 feet below the surface. The remains were transported to the Oklahoma State Medical Examiner's office. DNA analysis took several weeks. On April 29, 2020, the results came back. The remains were confirmed to be those of Amy Jo Hatfield. The arrest warrants were issued on May 4, 2020. Danny Hatfield was arrested in Amarillo and charged with first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse. He was extradited to Oklahoma and held without bond in the Grady County Jail. Kirsten Hatfield was arrested at her trailer in Oklahoma City and charged with accessory after the fact and obstruction of justice. Her bond was set at $50,000, which she could not afford. She remained in custody. The community of Verden, which had largely forgotten the case, was shocked. Local news stations covered the arrests extensively. Reporters interviewed residents who remembered the search in 1987. Mrs. Briggs, in her nursing home, told a journalist, "I always wondered. I always knew something wasn't right." Others expressed disbelief. "Danny was quiet," said a former coworker, "but he didn't seem like the kind of person who could do something like that." In June 2020, Kirsten Hatfield, facing the possibility of decades in prison, made a deal with prosecutors. In exchange for a reduced sentence, she agreed to testify against Danny and provide a full account of what had happened on the night of April 14, 1987. Her statement, given in a pre-trial deposition, was recorded and later entered into evidence. She said that Danny had come home that night around 10:30, not in the morning as they had claimed. He had been drinking. He and Amy Jo had gotten into an argument because the child would not stay in bed. Danny had lost his temper. He had struck Amy Jo. She had fallen and hit her head on the corner of a dresser. She had not gotten up. "I didn't know what to do," Kirsten said. Her voice on the recording was barely audible. "He said it was an accident. He said if we called 911, they would take Michael away, they would put us in jail. He said we had to hide it." Kirsten said that Danny wrapped Amy Jo's body in a blanket and carried her out to his truck. He told Kirsten to get Michael and come with him. She did. They drove south to a place Danny knew near Sugar Creek, a wooded area where he had hunted as a teenager. They dug a shallow grave. Kirsten said she stood and watched, holding Michael, who was silent and confused. They buried Amy Jo there. "We went home," Kirsten said. "We cleaned the bedroom. We made it look like she had vanished. In the morning, I called 911. I said what Danny told me to say." Prosecutors asked why she had not come forward in the years since. Kirsten said she was afraid of Danny. She was afraid of losing Michael. She was afraid of being blamed. She was afraid of the truth. Danny Hatfield's trial began in October 2021. He pleaded not guilty to all charges, claiming that Kirsten's account was false, that she was lying to save herself. His defense attorney argued that there was no physical evidence directly linking Danny to the crime, that Michael's memories were unreliable, and that Kirsten's testimony was motivated by self-interest. But the prosecution presented a compelling case. They showed the timeline discrepancies from 1987. They presented Michael's testimony, now an adult willing to face his father in court. Michael testified about the fragments of memory that had haunted him for decades. He described the smell of dirt, the sound of his mother crying, the image of his father carrying something heavy. He said he had buried these memories because acknowledging them meant confronting an unbearable truth. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. On October 22, 2021, they returned a verdict, guilty on all counts. Danny Hatfield was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kirsten Hatfield, having cooperated with prosecutors, was sentenced to 15 years, with credit for time served. Michael Hatfield did not attend the sentencing. He released a brief statement through his attorney. "I hope my sister can finally rest. I hope telling the truth brings some measure of peace to everyone who loved her." The case of Amy Jo Hatfield is a reminder that some truths take decades to surface, that silence can be as destructive as violence, and that justice, though delayed, can still arrive. For 34 years, a little girl lay in an unmarked grave in a clearing near Sugar Creek. For 34 years, those who knew what happened carried that knowledge like a stone. For 34 years, a community wondered. Amy Jo Hatfield was 4 years old when she died. She liked to play with toy shopping carts. She waved at neighbors. She wore a red dress at Christmas and smiled for photographs. She deserved more than the life she was given, and more than the silence that followed her death. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.